Well, all right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to American History Class. You may not recognize me with the trim. I actually kind of look like a productive citizen and a part of civilization who doesn't talk to volleyballs for the first time in a month or so here. But anyway, we'll pick up our discussion of the 1990s. Which is kind of this great decade of contradictions. On one hand, it's one of the most prosperous times in American history. On the other hand, it's one of the periods of time with some of the most. It's kind of the breeding ground for the collapse of the ability of people of political persuasions to work with each other. It's also kind of known for a lot of alienation and high crime, and just a whole bunch of kind of disconcerting cultural trends at the same time that things are doing really well economically and the world's at relative peace. The 90s, one other thing that I don't know if I got this across enough the other day, was talking about that how strange of a time it was, in that it was this period where the Soviet Union had fallen and America is really alone in the leadership of the world. So we're working towards greater cooperation with all these different nations and so on. But it looks like the world is kind of in this kind of state of relative peace and prosperity that we kind of thought might last. That some people were saying might last forever. And then we'll see how kind of the terrorist attacks of 9/11 are really the wake-up call that that's probably not the way it's going to go down. But either way, we talked the other day, so Bill Clinton runs as a moderate in the 92 election, defeats President Bush with the help of a strong independent, Ross Perot. And Clinton immediately starts making some overtures to his left with Don't Ask, Don't Tell, with the Hillary Care health care plan that was highly controversial, with some tax increases, and he pays a huge price for it in the first midterm election in 1994 when the Republicans sweep both houses of Congress. Republicans take the majority of the southern seats for the first time in history since the Republican-Democrat split, or since those have been the two parties. The Republicans had started voting for the South had started voting for Republican presidents a little further back, but it still took a few decades to catch up to the congressional level. There still were a lot of Southern Democrats in Congress until the mid 2000s. But Newt Gingrich, the Speaker of the House, kind of emerges as the leader of the so-called Republican Revolution. And they came pushing a lot of really great ideas, only a few of which actually happened. But the Clinton-Gingrich era, although there was a lot of personal animosity, and although it's the time where relationships between parties really start breaking down, and it's kind of helps fuel the kind of partisan warfare era of things. I should say I didn't talk about it because your book didn't kind of glanced over it, but I feel like this is worth talking about. You can make the case one of the first real steps towards the nonstop partisan warfare era of politics happened in the late 1980s when the Democrats started to realize how important Supreme Court justices were and started trying to go scorched earth on Republican Supreme Court justice nominees. The first case was a fellow by the name of Robert Bork, who we talked about. He had, some ties to the Nixon administration that made him a little bit of a political liability, and he was savaged and slandered in a very vicious and partisan way. And then Clarence Thomas, who was a Bush appointee, was accused, it appears falsely, of sexual harassment, and was called all kinds of terrible names and so on. This kind of leads to people realizing, okay, judicial appointments are war, and because that's where so much of the law happens in real terms these days. You started to build a conservative judiciary apparatus that has led to where you now have a lot fewer. A lot more strong conservative candidates for judgeships when there are Republican presidents, whereas in a previous period of time, even because people hadn't really realized how important the Supreme Court was becoming in the modern system, which is honestly, it's become too important in the modern system. But Ronald Reagan and George Bush appointed people like Sandra Day O'Connor and David Souter and some other justices that wound up being at best moderate, and in some cases very liberal. I mean, Souter was a full-on liberal, and O'Connor and Anthony Kennedy, who were Reagan nominees, both wound up being centrist and possibly even leaning to the left in a lot of major cases. The reason why, the reason why the Supreme Court instituted gay marriage nationwide in 2015, the reason why they refused to overturn Roe versus Wade in a 1992 case called Doe versus Bolton, where they could have, was largely due to the votes of Reagan-appointed justices, O'Connor and Kennedy. So, it wasn't until the 90s that everyone kind of realized, okay, you got to treat this whole, judge thing like it's a major thing. But because up until then, typically presidential appointments of justices and as well as cabinet posts typically were kind of rubber stamp situations. Like they would usually get passed like 97-3 and stuff like that in the Senate, and now they start becoming like major battles. So that was a part of it. But then Gingrich comes in. He kind of helps. He kind of had a politics as war mindset and applies that to a handful of policies that he instituted that kind of helped kind of create an atmosphere of permanent war. Although I like a lot of what Gingrich did, there also were some things he did that were kind of mistakes in hindsight in terms of our inability to get anything done. But during the period, despite the fact that there was a lot of acrimony in the 90s, people were still able to get stuff done. And so, the government was run fairly well. There was, a balanced budget for the first time in a long time for several years in the 1990s. In the 2000 presidential election, one of the main issues is the government actually has, millions of dollars more than we need. What should we do with the extra money? That's not a conversation we've had in the last 15 years. I promise you that. So the divided government actually worked well. Clinton and Gingrich kind of checked each other, and then, passed, like we mentioned, some important bills. A crime bill that most people think is a mistake now on both sides, although there are a few defenders. But then, a very strong welfare reform bill that passed on a bipartisan basis, although with a lot of liberals really complaining about it. So there was a handful of, the Defense of Marriage Act, which, kind of protected traditional definitions of marriage, left to the states, there's a lot, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. So there's actually a lot of bipartisan and sometimes even kind of conservative legislation that passed in the 90s, despite the fact that, honestly, you can kind of make the case that there's a lot of more important conservative legislation passed during the Clinton years than in some recent Republican presidents. So the question is, why did the right hate Bill Clinton so much? Well, some of that is just... some of that is a weird psychological phenomenon where, a lot of times people that are closer to you, you hate them more for small differences than you would someone far from you. But the most important factor are some of the things that we will talk about today as it relates to the constant scandals that were going on in what was a very, very deeply corrupt presidency. But before we get there, we'll talk a little bit about some of Clinton's stuff as it relates. So Clinton era, we get involved in several foreign conflicts, never a full-scale war, but a lot of times a handful of troops being sent as part of international coalitions or what have you. Clinton continued an intervention in Somalia that I think may have had I think we may have already had some troops there under Bush. I can't swear to it. But there was an incident, which if you saw the movie Black Hawk Down, this is what that movie is about. There's an incident. We were there providing humanitarian support in Somalia because there was a humanitarian crisis. Dictator was starving his people to death. The UN was trying to send in food to help them. Tribal warlords were intercepting the food before it could get to the people. Which there's a great SNL sketch with Phil Hartman playing Bill Clinton where he's jogging into a McDonald's and he is shoving his face full of other people's McDonald's food while trying to use it as an object lesson to explain the Somalia operation. And he's just stealing French fries from children, and it's hilarious. So in the process, we wound up losing an American helicopter too, and one of our helicopter crew winds up getting drugged through the streets and humiliated and murdered. So that was kind of a little bit of a national embarrassment. We also were involved in the overthrow of a regime in Haiti. We got involved in the civil war in former Yugoslavia, which had broken into several different countries, some of which were disputing who had what, and there was a lot of genocide happening between sides, because the Yugoslav situation, it was very divided between 6 or 7 different ethnic groups with 3 or 4 main religious affiliations, and it just got into a lot of ethnic and tribal warfare. We sent some troops in to kind of intervene in that situation, first by some troops on the ground in Bosnia, and then by some aerial bombings of Serbia in the later part of the Clinton years. We also got involved in some tussles with Saddam Hussein's Iraq once again, because Saddam tried to assassinate former President Bush as retaliation for what happened in the Gulf War. We responded by some airstrikes there. We also launched some airstrikes in the late 90s in response to accusations of, I think it was, of chemical weapons. So Saddam had kind of remained a threat, and hold that thought, because that's going to be a big deal in these last 2 days of class when we talk about the Iraq War. So a lot of involvement by American troops in these kind of nation-building exercises, or trying to keep peace in international situations. The 1990s is also the period of time where we begin to have a lot of struggles with terrorism. And in the 2000s and 2010s, that is predominantly Islamic terrorism. In the 90s, it was a kind of a two-front problem with Islamic terrorism and also right-wing extremist terrorism here in America. So the background of that, obviously, obviously you have always had your, kind of handful of kind of, anti-government white supremacist kooks out in the woods. That's not necessarily a new phenomenon in the 90s that had, existed for a little while, but it was kind of experiencing some growth in the 90s, and it was exacerbated by the fact that the Clinton-era Justice Department was run by a woman named Janet Reno, who was a horrible human being. And there were at least 3 major police actions of the Clinton Justice Department that were highly controversial and problematic. The third one's not particularly, chronologically, the third of the 3 major ones I can think of. There might be more. But the third one is not especially germane to this discussion, but it was, they actually sent in troops with machine guns to go pull a Cuban immigrant whose his mother had escaped with him as a kid, and then his dad wanted him back in Cuba, but his grandparents wanted to keep him because he's growing up in, free country and all this stuff. And anyway, we decided, the government had decided to send him back to Cuba, and they literally broke into this kid's house with machine guns and pulled him out of a closet. It was, famous, really striking photo of this ran in the paper. That was a really messed up situation. So that was one of them, but the 2 that directly cause kind of the wave of violence here, you have a fellow by the name of Randy Weaver at a place called Ruby Ridge out in the West. Again, bad guy, white, neo-Nazi type fella, not especially sympathetic. But the FBI descended on his place and started shooting before, I want to say maybe he shot at a dog, or they didn't identify themselves, and then all these people just opened fire on the house, because he fired a shot, not realizing that they were FBI because they never said they were. By the time the whole thing is done, they've like shot and killed his wife, and there was like an infant that the wife was holding who both take bullets through the door. And then I can't remember if he was convicted of what he was charged with. I think it was a guns violation or something. Again, not a good guy, but you can't do that. You have to say that you're FBI. And then you can't shoot at the guy because he's shooting at what he assumes to be robbers or something. So then you have a cult in Waco, Texas, known as the Branch Davidians. They were led by a fellow by the name of David Koresh. And Koresh very likely could have been imprisoned on sex offender charges because of some of the, especially child sexual abuse that was happening within the cult. But the reason really that they were wanting to arrest him was because they had been stockpiling a lot of weapons. Now, some of this is also because they sold some weapons as well as a business that helped run the whole thing. Ultimately, they use extremely excessive force in breaking up this situation. Like they've got, basically a military level response to just this little kind of fringe cult out in Texas, and it winds up with dozens of people dead in what could have been a much simpler response, and it seems like some of this was kind of exaggerated for the camera. So the combination of this and a few other things caused the problem is you've got these people that are extremists, that are a little bit dangerous, that are afraid of the government and all this stuff. Well, one way that you don't get rid of that movement is by convincing them that they actually have reason to be afraid of the government, and so you wind up with someone of this same general persuasion, a fellow by the name of Timothy McVeigh, winds up trying to get revenge for Ruby Ridge and Waco by driving a truck bomb into the Oklahoma City headquarters of the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, which was it housed several federal agencies, including the IRS, and I think maybe there might have been some FBI there, but it was a bunch of federal agencies had offices in this. It basically was an office building for the western branches of federal agencies. And so he drives a truck bomb into this place and kills, I can't remember the numbers, but it was between dozens and hundreds of people, including a lot of children who were in a preschool. Like, it was a really messed up thing. He and an accomplice are executed for it. So you've got this kind of domestic unrest, and then you also start having some foreign terrorism as well. One thing is that the World Trade Center, 8 years before the planes crashed into it, actually was bombed. It was a terrorist attack that was masterminded by a fellow that they called the Blind Sheikh, because he was blind and he was a sheikh, and so there weren't too many deaths, but it could have been disastrous. Had the attack going as planned. But there also was another domestic terror situation, a couple of other domestic terror situations. A bombing of the Atlanta Olympics in 1996 was kind of done by another right-wing extremist type person. You had this was actually, then you had the Unabomber, who's actually a little bit more leftist in his politics than those guys, but still had that whole backwoods against civilization ethos going on. And he was actually kind of a rabid environmentalist, if I'm not mistaken. He opposed modernization, and so he was sending bombs through the mail to, especially to universities and places like that, that he thought were fueling the that's not a word, fueling the advancement of society into more technological forms and in what he considered to be less natural ways of living. So lots of terrorism in the 90s. But back to the foreign stuff, the 1990s, we also see, the first wave of Islamic terrorism that's going to really crest in the 2000s. And A lot of this is done in response to there was an element of radical Islam that did not like American troops setting foot in the land of Saudi Arabia during the Persian Gulf War, which is where we kind of based our troops during that invasion. They thought Americans should not have defiled what they considered to be holy ground. And they also resented American support for the nation of Israel, along with some other things. Along with, we talked about how Ayatollah Khomeini called America the Great Satan, and kind of, looked at America as kind of the root of all the sin that they thought was pulling the world away from Islam. So, and in general, these radical Islamic groups wanted to establish worldwide Islamic government under what they call Sharia law, which is the traditional law of Islam. So that was connected to the World Trade Center bombing, but also an organization known as Al-Qaeda, led by one Osama bin Laden, formerly one of our guys on the ground in the Soviet-Afghan War, starts attacking the United States and begins with, late in the Clinton years, a bombing via a truck bombing of 2 American embassies, either on the same day or within a couple days, one in the nation of Kenya, the other in Tanzania. Both of those are African countries. And the 2 embassy bombings kind of made bin Laden famous. On 9/11, when it happened, my first thought as I watched it was, I wonder if it was this bin Laden guy. So he was already notorious before 9/11. And then, one thing that Clinton gets knocked for now was that it's now widely acknowledged that Clinton kind of had an opportunity to order, the trigger to be pulled on bin Laden at a period after the embassy bombings, and for whatever political reasons declined, which turned out to be a pretty grave mistake, because bin Laden would soon mastermind the most deadly terror attack in United States history. I was looking for my water, but I guess I finished it. Okay, so meanwhile, in addition to all the controversial police actions and, some of the most of his military operations had a decent bipartisan support. There was Republican pushback on involvement in a couple of them. And even a few liberals, didn't like a couple of things we were doing. But for the most part, where Clinton gets his, became such a reviled name in right-wing circles has a lot to do with some of these scandals that he's associated with. And Clinton, the man is a sleazeball. I mean, he is a sleazy dude. This Jeffrey Epstein fellow, I know y'all are familiar with the situation we talked about once or twice, he and Jeffrey Epstein are riding on airplanes together, going back and forth to, his island of iniquity. He's had, before he even is elected, it becomes obvious that he's had numerous affairs, some of which were, cheating on his wife and immoral, but were, at least consensual. But some of which seemed like there were a few people that were accusing him of sexual harassment, and even 1 or 2 accusations of outright sexual assault. And while it's never really been absolutely proven that he was a rapist, but there's evidence to suggest that the accusations weren't bunk. I think if you put a gun to my head and said, yes, did Bill Clinton ever commit sexual assault, yes or no, and my life depended on getting the right answer, I would probably guess yes. He, at the very least, was a horribly lecherous human being, who, with not a lot of self-control, as it relates to this sort of thing. So we already knew that he was kind of a sleazeball going into the presidency, but he also had a few other scandals chasing him coming into the presidency. There was one of the ones that's most consequential was something known as the Whitewater scandal, and it was connected to ultimately it was connected to his time as the governor of Arkansas. One of the All right, so basically, the president had invested in a company known as the Whitewater Development Corporation, which was a resort in northeastern Arkansas. And then Governor Clinton had kind of done some things to, as far as the rules and regulations of the state of Arkansas, to unfairly favor the company that he had money invested in through some intermediates. And it really becomes a big scandal early on in his presidency that leads to an independent counsel being appointed by the name of Kenneth Starr. And the independent counsel was a statute. It's kind of a flawed statute the way they set it up. But after Watergate, the Congress had said, Nixon kept trying to fire his prosecutors, so we should create a new office that is a prosecutor that is not under the president, so that if there's a case where a president is implicated in a scandal, we can create this independent counsel and they can't be fired by the president. Well, the problem with that, there's some constitutional questions about that, because it is the executive branch is the one who's invested with the ability to manage, to enforce the laws. And so there's a little bit of questions about whether that was really a constitutionally sound system, but nonetheless, it is what they had in place at the time. And the independent counsel statute lends itself towards partisan warfare and investigation a little bit, because they're not accountable to the executive branch. But on the other hand, this is, the alternative is, the guy can fire his prosecutor. Now, and this was a big. Now, in the Trump impeachment scandal, which happened over the last year or so, there were many, many times that Trump considered, according to all the reports, that he considered firing the prosecutor. But the thing that kept him from doing it was realizing that would probably hurt his case in impeachment hearings. So impeachment is kind of the only check on keeping a president from firing his prosecutor if you don't have an independent counsel. Anyway, there was an independent counsel statute at the time, though. Congress appoints one by the name of Kenneth Starr. And he begins investigating Whitewater. In addition to Whitewater, there were several other scandals. There was one called Travelgate that involved misappropriation of funds that related to White House travel. There were a number of campaign finance violations. There was some evidence that the president, and particularly through Vice President Al Gore, had taken campaign contributions from China while they were in the middle of negotiating whether to involve China in Clinton. The Clinton administration made the decision to give China something that they called most favored nation status, which basically brought them on an equal playing field in international trade with say, a country like Canada or something like that we trade with very, very freely. That limited the ability to put tariffs and stuff on Chinese goods, to certain levels and so on. And that is kind of one of the final straws in making China one of the most important trading partners for the United States. And that was kind of a controversial decision at the time. There was a bipartisan consensus in favor of it in terms of the party leadership, although you did have some conservatives that kind of dissented from the leadership. It was like, this is insane. And so that was, whether you support that or not, and economically it was good in the short term, but I think it's probably, unfortunately, strengthened the Chinese Communist Party and given it too much of a say in world affairs. But, so in hindsight, I wish we hadn't done it. But anyway, regardless of what you think about it, it might be the most important decision Clinton made on foreign policy. And it happens around the same time that the Communist Chinese are going nuclear. So it was done in it was a high stakes period of time. And during all of this going on, you have evidence that Clinton was illegally taking Chinese campaign donations. You had another scandal related to renting out the Lincoln bedroom in the White House to campaign donors. There was one thing that happens. Well, here, I'll save that for after impeachment. So So it's just one thing after another, a different scandal every day. And so and there are a couple Clinton associates that kind of died under odd looking circumstances during this period of time, which really fueled a lot of conspiracy theories on the right. So in the midst of all this, Kenneth Starr, in the midst of his Whitewater investigation, uncovers the fact that Clinton had an illicit affair with a White House intern by the name of Monica Lewinsky, who at the time was like 21, 22, somewhere in there. And of course, Clinton was, in his late 40s, early 50s or whatever. And so, this affair goes on for a little while. I'm not sure exactly how long, maybe a year, something like that. It was certainly not the only one he had, I'm sure. But Clinton's chief political advisor during his second term was a fellow by the name of Dick Morris, who had also been his advisor in Arkansas. And Dick Morris swears that at one point when he was president, that he and President Clinton shared an elevator, and Clinton's political hero was John F. Kennedy, and Morris asked him, a reporter asked him, if you could ask John F. Kennedy one thing, about the job, what would you ask him? And he gave some kind of mealy-mouthed answer, I'd ask him how to lead America and blah, 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 like he does. And then he and Morris got on the elevator, and Clinton said, what I'd really wanted to say is, how'd you get away with it? So, again, Morris has a real axe to grind. He kind of has made made his living in a kind of an anti-Clinton racket ever since. So, take it with a grain of salt. But that's what he says. So Clinton, has this affair, and then in the midst of it, a woman named Paula Jones sues Clinton for sexual harassment related to stuff that happened back when he was governor of Arkansas. In the course of that lawsuit, which is allowed to proceed, the attorneys for Jones tried to build a plausibility case by exposing, working on the character aspect of thing to establish that it's plausible that he would have, sexually harassed. Well, in the midst of all this, the Lewinsky affair turns up, which, was a pretty big deal because, it involves a staffer. And so that's always a little bit of a, when you've got a really powerful man having that sort of relationship with a staffer, with a young intern, a college age intern. I mean, there's a lot of questions about appropriateness and stuff like that enter into that, even outside the obvious fact that it's a sin to commit adultery. So Clinton, when asked about the Lewinsky affair during this hearing, lies about it, openly lies about it. Commits perjury, absolutely, positively. That's been proven. So lies under oath, and then he's accused of allegedly trying to get other associates within his sphere to go along with the lie or to not speak against him. A lot of this is actually uncovered by a woman named Linda Tripp, who was an associate of Monica Lewinsky, who actually audio taped conversations with her, which, people had some questions about that, but that did definitively prove that he had, that he had done a lot of the things he was accused of. And so Kenneth Starr's investigation of Whitewater was still open, begins to move the Lewinsky scandal into his campaign portfolio. And eventually this leads to actually bringing articles of impeachment against President Clinton on charges of perjury and obstruction of justice. This was surprisingly not a popular move with people. The reason I say surprisingly is that it's obvious that he did those two things. It is obvious that Bill Clinton lied, including under oath. It is obvious that he obstructed justice, and it's also obvious that any of us would go to prison had we done those two things. However, the Clinton PR machine really kind of spun this idea of, why are you snooping around this guy's private life? Why do you care about what he's doing in the bedroom? Leave this stuff alone. And so they kind of created this kind of case that they really tried to turn it into it just being a sex scandal and not being a case of perjury and obstruction of justice. But he wasn't on trial for the adultery. Although, in actuality, you can get fired. If you're found to have committed adultery, you can actually be fired from government jobs because it's considered blackmail bait. You can lose your security. A lot of people, high-ranking, who have been high-ranking Army officials and stuff like that, have lost their security clearances and been removed from their positions when it discovered, because if you have, an affair, that's considered to be something that you could easily be blackmailed by enemies of the United States. So that is actually not an irrelevant thing. In addition to the fact that you want the president or another official to kind of be a good example of morality for the people as kind of the face of the nation, even if you didn't care about that and you said, okay, if you get the job done, I don't care what you do in your personal life, even if you took that attitude, it's still a little bit of a danger to have people with that many skeletons in their closet in high places with security clearances. So, particularly when they actually know the nuclear codes and have the right to launch a strike, and they're commander-in-chief of the armed forces. So anyway, this leads to a brutally ugly impeachment fight that lasts a year and a half. Really makes it hard for anyone to get anything done. So the last 2 years of Clinton's term are functionally wasted, which might not have been a bad thing from a Republican perspective. Less time for him to push through things that they might not have wanted. And so it winds up being, impeachment consumes politics for like a year and a half. But it winds up being politically unpopular. Actually, it kind of winds up hurting the Republicans in the polls a little bit. This and the other thing, I can't remember if I mentioned this or not the other day. In the process of getting to the balanced budget thing, there were two different occasions where Gingrich played political hardball to the point of shutting down the government. And, that is, he lets the budget run out without there being a new bill, meaning there wasn't actually money to pay the government agencies. And so the government just shuts down, and none of the, Social Security checks don't go. Well, they might have gone out because they were considered essential. But, a lot of military people might have missed pay. A lot of federal jobs, people missed paychecks, or at least got them delayed. National parks closed. A lot of national services closed. So those scandals hurt their, not scandals, those decisions, even though they might have been the right thing to do toward getting the budget balanced, hurt the Republicans politically in the short term. So they're already kind of reeling from that, and then the impeachment thing winds up backfiring on them a little bit, hurts their popularity, especially because in the midst of it, Gingrich, the Speaker of the House, in the midst of, launching this campaign about Clinton largely, which was, on paper, it was about the perjury and the obstruction of justice, but culturally, the sexual misconduct was a big part of it as well, of why it was, why the story caught so much fire. Well, then it turns out that Gingrich had been actually cheating on his wife while his wife had cancer. So that combined with some other stuff that's real intra-party hardball that was causing him to lose some popularity among other Republican congressmen leads to Gingrich getting kicked out. So he actually resigns as Speaker of the House. He's replaced by another guy named Bob Livingston, who, as he's like Speaker of the House for like a couple weeks, when it turns out that he also had an affair, which once again, looked bad in the midst of everything. So Livingston then resigns as Speaker of the House, and he's finally replaced by a guy named Dennis Hastert. Well, Dennis Hastert, it took a while for his scandal to break, so he didn't resign right away. But we found out years later that Dennis Hastert actually he actually was, I believe, found guilty of having touched little boys. So it was not the group of people that you wanted to really be leading a moral crusade against Bill Clinton that were in charge of the Republican House at the time. So certainly if you're kind of a family values voter sitting watching the news in 1998, 99, you would have to look at Washington and say, oh my God, they've lost their minds. Yeah. And I'm not sure, was it really worse in the 90s than it was in the 60s, or did we just know more about this stuff because the media was in a different place? I don't know. I mean, we know that Eisenhower and Kennedy and a bunch of other people had extramarital affairs, and it just didn't hit the press the way it would have today. So I don't know if things were really worse in the 90s or if we just knew they were worse. But either way, the political class of the 1990s, not the greatest exemplars of morality by any means. So Clinton actually is impeached in the House of Representatives. He does have, again, the way impeachment works is the impeachment is like the indictment by a grand jury, and then that happens in the House of Representatives, and it goes to the Senate where they vote to convict or acquit. And if convicted, they're removed from office. So what happens is, at the time, the Republicans held the House. I think the Democrats had maybe taken back the Senate by that time. So if that's not the case, no, I don't think they'd taken back the Senate, but I think the Democrats all voted in lockstep, and then there weren't enough Republicans to push it over. And everyone knew kind of how it was going to go for the most part. A lot of people questioned the wisdom of the Republicans proceeding with impeachment, knowing that the conviction wasn't going to come. The same way a lot of people questioned the decision of the Democrats to pursue impeachment against Trump, knowing that conviction wasn't going to come. Because if you know they're not going to be convicted, what's the point in wasting all the time and energy and money and manpower? But nonetheless, Clinton is impeached. He's the first president formally impeached since Andrew Johnson back in the 1860s. Of course, if you remember, Johnson was really impeached for purely political reasons, but also some valid ones. And really, they were trying to change Reconstruction policy. And then Nixon was going to be impeached if he hung around, but he quit before he could be. So Clinton is the first impeached president since Johnson. Trump's been impeached since. But one thing that all three impeached presidents have in common is that none of them actually were removed. We have never had a president convicted in a Senate impeachment trial and then removed. Three of them have been impeached. A fourth that would have been Nixon would have been impeached and removed had he not quit. So the impeachment process scared him away from the presidency, and so he's kind of the only one to kind of leave under that kind of cloud. But Clinton is able to finish his term, as was Johnson, as is Trump. So, which kind of causes a lot of people to question whether impeachment really works.